Matt Frei, today we're going to talk about sham referendums, partial mobilisation in Russia, and also Ukraine's counteroffensive. What are you going to tell me?
Sham referendums, they're sham. They were taking place in the parts of eastern Ukraine the Russians still occupy. The results are in. Guess what? 96% in favour of staying in the Russian Federation, except hardly anyone was voting, and those that did, we suspect, were voting under duress. But this does give Putin the excuse to say that if you now attack bits of Ukraine, you're going to attack the Russian Federation and you're going to pay for that. We're now in a moment of maximum peril of this war. Nuclear threats issued by Vladimir Putin, coming into a cold winter, the West bracing itself for a cold shower, holding tight on sanctions. Ukrainians are praying that we do so. Some Europeans are thinking, is it worth it?
Matt, you're back in Ukraine now, in Kyiv, the capital, and you haven't actually been there since, well, when the war began, late February, and you were there in March as well. What's it like? What's the difference?
The difference here in Kyiv is that it is actually, astonishingly calm, really. I mean, we've had one alarm going off in the last few days, which had people scuttling around a little bit. There was a bit of nervousness, but essentially you don't hear the sound of sirens, which is what we heard at the beginning of the war, all the time. You hear the sound of church bells. In fact, you might hear them during this broadcast. And things have changed cosmetically. So, for instance, down below is St. Michael's Cathedral. That's the one with the wonderful golden onion dome. And in front of it, there's a display of burnt out Russian tanks, the trophies of war. All around, people are walking, they're going to their offices, they're going to restaurants and bars and cafes. The difference is that there's a curfew on, and so everyone has to be off the roads by 11 o'clock at night. So there's a remarkable degree of normality here, and also a remarkable degree of confidence about where this war is heading.
Reading around about what's going on in Ukraine, there is a sense that the big shift is that they now believe that they can win the war. I think polling suggests 98% of Ukrainians think they can win the war. Is that what you sense?
There's an enormous amount of optimism. There always, there has been rhetorical optimism ever since the beginning of the war. After the initial shock had subsided, there was this sort of commitment from any politician you spoke to here that, we're not just, in it to hold on or to survive, we're in it to win it. But I think those words, that rhetoric has now, had some substance added to it by this, these rather extraordinary successes back in September. And, what are the main ingredients for why they're doing well? The most important is a very clear motivation about why they're fighting this war. This is about their survival, the survival of their nation, the survival of their families, the survival of their persons.
Now, Vladimir Putin has done two important things recently, mainly in response to the counteroffensive by Ukrainian troops. First, he's announced a partial mobilisation.
As Putin calls up 300,000 reserves and threatens nuclear weapons, the first signs of protest in Russia as fighting-age men try to flee the country.
And he's held referenda in occupied areas of Ukraine, in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, in Luhansk and Donetsk.
In partially Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, they vote in sham referendums.
They've been called a sham by the West, but the results are in, and they are basically all allegedly massively in favour of joining the Russian Federation. How much of a sham are those referendums, and what is Putin up to?
Well, there may be some people in those occupied areas who want to be part of the Russian Federation. There were some people there before the war began, but we don't know how big that number is. And what you've got to remember is that in cities like Mariupol, which was part of the referendum, we now think that the population at the moment is about 150,000. Now, some people have been carted off to Russia, some people have escaped to the West or to the Ukrainian side, and that's not exactly a quorum for a referendum. At the same time, we have had evidence of people being forced to vote in a certain way. So, you've got wandering ballot boxes that go from door to door, and accompanying those ballot boxes for security are Russian soldiers. Well, you get a knock on the door, and the babushka comes along with a ballot paper, and you're asked to, to put your, to tick a box, and you've got three soldiers standing next to her. That's not exactly free and fair, right? But that's not the point here. The point is that I think Vladimir Putin, after this September offensive from the Ukrainians that was so successful, began to panic and did especially one thing that he wanted to avoid all along. Because remember, this was a war that was not supposed to be, first of all, called a war. It was still called officially a special military operation, and not a war that would fray the social compact of Russia, which is You let us do the fighting and the knocking together of heads, and we'll take some of you to do that, professional soldiers, but you can carry on living your life almost as if nothing was happening on your doorstep. Well, that's social contract. Apathy in return for control. Acquiescence in return for not having to actually get involved in the fight. That has been frayed by Ukraine's success, because Putin cannot be seen to be losing. That's why he's launched this mobilization. Apparently, this is something that he's been trying to avoid for months. And of course, they called it a partial mobilization of 300,000 men. And then they let the cat slip out of the bag that actually it might be a more full mobilization of up to 1 million men, if not more. Now, this has impacted on millions of ordinary Russian families inside Russia. And Russian men of fighting age don't want to fight in Ukraine because even they, with this controlled media, have got the message that it's not going particularly well. They might die if they get there. And of course, reports of casualties are imprecise, but it's tens of thousands of Russian soldiers that have lost life or limb. And also, why are we there in the first place? But here, certainly, based on what every conversation I've had with just about everyone, they know exactly what they're fighting for.
It also seems that that partial mobilisation, we'll come into referendum again in a bit, but that partial mobilisation, I was reading that, the Institute for the Study of War was saying that Putin seems far more concerned with rushing bodies to the battlefield than with addressing fundamental flaws in their tactics. I mean, we're seeing, on the one hand, Russians not wanting to go to war, but also it seems that seems to be a rather sort of rushed attempt by Putin, when actually there's a much deeper, as you were saying, problem with what's going on in terms of this war not going the way Russia wants it to.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I guess every war is a kind of learning curve. And the Russians seem to have learned from some of their bigger mistakes at the beginning of the war, when you had these four very large, military components that were not really talking to each other. But what they haven't done is learn the other lesson, which is that if you want to occupy Ukraine, which is a massive country, you need a huge number of people to do so. And you need to be quite smart about how you use your weaponry. And they did neither, right? So getting back to the point about the referenda, I think it's part of a sort of panicky move. Throw people at it, even if they're not very well trained. Throw men at it that may become cannon fodder. And secondly, raise the stakes for both Ukraine and the West. So by having these territories, which Russia still occupies, by annexing them, which is what we expect Putin to do in a big speech on Friday, he's effectively saying, if you attack those areas, which used to be part of Ukraine, but are now part of the Russian Federation, you are attacking Russia directly, which of course is something that the Ukrainians have so far avoided from doing mostly. Right? There have been a couple of missiles, but they've denied firing them. But now, if they're trying to get back bits of Luhansk or Donetsk, Putin can say, well, hang on, you're attacking Mother Russia, so we're going to fight back. He can also say the same to the West. You're using Western NATO-issued weapons in order to defeat Russian soldiers on their homeland. Therefore, we are now at war with NATO. Now, that is a possibility. So, we're in a great moment of peril. And that's always been the kind of calculation of this war. Ukraine's success raises the stakes for Putin and therefore raises the peril for all of us.
And Matt, you spoke to recently the deputy head of President Zelensky's office, Ihor Zhukva. What worries them in Ukraine at all, if anything does worry them? Is it the partial mobilisation that worries them, the more men coming to the front line? Or is it the referendum, which means that Putin changes the parameters, which means that he gets more aggressive if he thinks that they're going to start attacking Russian Federation territory, as he calls it?
No Ukrainian official will tell you this publicly, but I suspect that, as in all wars, the weaker side is always trying to draw its stronger friends into the conflict. And that's the case in Ukraine as well. So they've been drawing the rest, i.e. NATO, into the conflict, by getting NATO to send them the weapons that they don't have and use them very effectively. The annexation of these territories in the east, I think, actually plays to their favor. Because, of course, those areas are already occupied, and it's meaningless whether you have a referendum there or you declare it, part of the Russian Federation. They ignore that, and again, they're right to do so because this is a sham referendum. But at the same time, it raises the stakes for the West. And so that, in a sense, could be good news for the Ukrainians, because it would mean more weapons sent to them, more help from the West. I mean, on the kind of extreme end, it could mean the West getting involved with Russia in this war, that it becomes a genuine NATO-Russia conflict. But Ukraine is already involved, so for them that doesn't change the calculation that much. What they worry about most is war fatigue in the countries in Europe that are imposing sanctions.
So let's discuss the counteroffensive in depth then. The Ukrainian advances that have forced Putin's hand.
Ukrainian forces have retaken a number of key strategic towns from the Russians as they push even deeper into occupied territory.
They've managed to liberate towns and villages in the east near Kyiv, either pushing the Russians back or basically causing the Russian military to flee.
The counteroffensive has been moving so fast it's taken Moscow completely by surprise, as Russia's defense ministry claimed its hasty retreat was designed to regroup.
Matt, how did that amazing Ukrainian counteroffensive come about? Because it's basically the Ukrainians tricking the Russians, right?
It's astonishing. I mean, first of all, remember that the front line really didn't move for months. I mean, roughly from April, it was like the First World War. You know, everyone was stuck in their trenches and the front line moved a couple of meters left or right, but not much more than that. All the while, the Ukrainians were clearly planning this offensive. Now, as you say, it's astonishing that the Russians didn't, see the trick. The Ukrainians moved troops south to try and get Kherson or make encroachments on the Kherson region. So the Russians, instead of leaving the front line as it was, they moved some of their troops, they redeployed them down to the southern areas to defend that. But Western intelligence believes essentially the front line that the Russians had conquered quite quickly at the beginning of the war, was too thin, too frail, and so this sort of very simple move, you kind of have a decoy on the south, and at the same time you use those M142s, those artillery systems, in order to target not apartment blocks like the Russians have been doing, but targeting very specific things. So bridges, supply depots, the kind of main railroad that goes from north to south in that area. And then when they started their advance on September the 6th, they went in there and they moved incredibly rapidly. So they took 90 kilometers of territory, roughly London to Cambridge, in a couple of days. And wherever they went, they found evidence of Russians literally dropping their guns, dropping their food, and fleeing, which is astonishing, really. It means that Kyiv, the second city of Ukraine, which is up in the northeastern corner, very close to the Russian border, is now much safer than it was. And they can now concentrate on the south. Now, it's not all easy, because, of course, if they now use their troops to attack in the south, that means that they're more exposed in the north. But, we're getting reports, unconfirmed, but they're kind of beginning to sort of add up to a little bit of a puzzle, that some of the new recruits in Russia are already on the front line in Ukraine.
I just want to talk about how important has the timing of that counter-offensive and its success been? Because on the one hand, it shows the West that, look, by giving us your HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system that's been so important, we've managed to push the Russians back. And it comes at a time when they can say, look, we can beat the Russians ahead of this long, difficult winter where there may be an energy crisis. So is the timing really important to prove to the West, if they have any fatigue, that, look, if you give us the tools, if you give us the weapons, we can push the Russians back?
Nothing breeds success like success. And I think that's true for wars, for anything else. So the West was willing to send these weapons, but there was this sort of, this feeling that was creeping into the political bloodstream in Europe, also to some extent in America. Why are we sending all this stuff? Why are we putting up, with sanctions and incredibly high gas prices, which is causing, as we know in the UK, huge economic issues and political repercussions inside European countries? Why are we doing all this if it's not yielding any success? Well, it is now yielding success. The combination of sanctions, Ukrainian determination and Western weapons is yielding success. And I think they thought they need to show the rest of the world, the Western world, that it's working. And they need to do that before the onset of winter. And, and I remember talking to Jacques a couple of months ago, and he said, we're going to do this offensive. And that's what people, in war capitals always say, we're going to do another offensive. So you kind of believe them, but you don't really believe them. And then they did. So he was absolutely right, and the timing of his prediction was more or less correct as well. But obviously the Russians weren't listening. but Channel 4 viewers were listening. You were listening, Kieran. And he said the same thing is going to happen before Christmas. So there'll be another offensive, maybe in the south, which may not be as successful because the south is, the south, which is close to Crimea, of course, that's going to be very well defended. The Russians would have learned from their own mistakes in the last few weeks. So don't expect that to be a cakewalk. And I think that's what they're telling me here as well, that it's going to be much more difficult. The bells. Anyway, so, but it has changed the dynamic. And I think that they're using this momentum, this success, to say to the EU, look, guys, this is crucial. More sanctions, please. Make sure that people don't get wobbly.
Because at the moment in Europe, we saw defence officials from more than 40 countries are meeting to discuss, producing more weapons, supplying them to Ukraine. Zelensky's wants, long-range missiles that can hit Russian territory. But obviously the annexation issue makes that more of an issue, as well as you say, the south, they're moving a lot slower there. The Russians can defend that better. They have more entrenched positions. And so that's the real issue, isn't it, going ahead, is what the West is willing to do in the long run, combined with the fact that the next stage of the war could be a lot longer and bloodier.
Indeed, and I think the Russians are trying to play for time because they hope that they can use the winter break, if there is going to be a break, to regroup, to get more ammunitions, to restitch their relationship with China, which has become a bit frayed over recent months. The Russians want to play a long game. They're trying various things, that are, unorthodox, shall we say. But the thing that motivates Vladimir Putin, if not the Russian population, is, of course, the spectre of 1917. There was First World War. It was going very badly for the Russians, for the Tsar. And at the tail end of this war, which was disastrous because the Russian population, Russian soldiers weren't bought into the concept. In fact, hardly anyone was, frankly. It was an argument between cousins who were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria that went horribly wrong, but involved millions of people being slaughtered. But on the Russian side, of course, it led to the Winter Revolution of 1917, which eventually brought the Bolsheviks to power. That is what Putin is most afraid of, that you get something similar happening in Russia.
Isn't the problem as well for Ukraine right now is that, as you say, Putin is in a flustered position, and the mobilisation, the partial mobilisation, all those troops, if they do want to train them and make sure that they can actually fight, it's going to take several weeks and months, etc. This is the moment right now for Ukraine to strike, surely, isn't it, in the south? This is the moment it really needs to use that point where the Russians are sort of weakened. And that's the conundrum there. They can't wait around for, officials in Brussels or Washington to decide what they're going to do. They need it now.
Well, I mean, the officials in Brussels and Washington, what they're about is mainly sanctions, and that's a slow burn. The most immediate issue is getting more weapons and munitions to have that second successful offensive, which, again, they tell us, is coming up anytime soon. So expect that to happen before the winter sets in and the ground freezes and it becomes much more difficult to dig trenches in the areas that you've occupied. And of course, that then, again, raises the stakes for Putin, because can you imagine another defeat like this? And the moment of peril for Ukraine, for Russia, but for all of us is now in the next few months. If there's another defeat for the Russians in the south, what does he do in order to fulfill his ultimate aim, which is to save his own skin, to stay in power? Because a Vladimir Putin who's lost this war is not going to be a Vladimir Putin who resides in the Kremlin or in his lavish palace in Sochi. He'll either be in a shallow grave or he'll be in jail or God knows what.
And so finally, Matt, I want to talk about the energy issue and the politics in Europe, because as we say, a lot of this comes down to Western support for Ukraine. Now, when it comes to the energy crisis and the energy issue, we saw the recent alleged sabotage of 2 pipelines transporting gas from Russia to Europe. Now, neither of those pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, are currently transporting gas to Europe because of the war in Ukraine. But they are close to those pipelines. A new one called the Baltic Pipeline that will take eventually gas from Norway to Poland to the rest of Europe.
It was at 2 a.m. local time on Monday that a seismograph on a small Danish island picked up the first tremor. Soon, the water off its coast started churning. And then, 15 hours later, another one, this time 2.3 magnitude. Not an earthquake, scientists say, but mid-water explosions, the force of which blew open 2 gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, now spewing unknown quantities of highly flammable methane up to its surface.
What's the worry there for Europe when it comes to that alleged sabotage?
It's a huge concern. As someone in Brussels said yesterday, the energy war has gone from cold to hot. What's not so certain, what's not so clear is why this would have happened. Although all the fingers are pointing at Russia, no one can really understand why they've done this. Because as you say, these pipelines, although they were full of gas, because you need gas inside the pipelines, even if you're not shipping it, in order to keep the pipeline apparently from imploding, from sort of being squashed in the sea under the pressure of the sea. So you have gas inside. And so they were fully loaded. 3 pipelines connected to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 had explosions going on. We know there were explosions because the Norwegian Seismic Institute said that there were these simultaneous seismic events that they monitored. Okay, so someone is doing something naughty here. Now, why would they do that? Why would the Russians do that? The worst case paranoid scenario is that they're trying different ways to attack Europe without actually attacking it militarily, but to provoke them into something together with the Americans that could then enlarge this war. It also, by the way, exposes the fact that the European Union, a market of 450 million people, still relies on its defense on either individual nations doing something or on the Americans. There is no collective European defense as such. So when Ursula von der Leyen stands up, as she did yesterday, and says, well, we're gonna strike back really hard, they better watch it, those Russians. What do you mean? You're going to buy even less Russian vodka and less Russian gas? There's no military, component here to Europe's retaliation, which may be a good thing. I mean, that's why we have the European Union. It came out of the Second World War, out of the ashes of the Second World War. But it also means that Europe lacks teeth, military teeth, in the face of this, rather aggressive bear on its doorstep.
And in terms of Europe and the politics, there are 2 things I'm thinking about. Obviously, firstly, there's the election of Giorgia Meloni, the far-right leader in Italy. She has supported Ukraine and criticised Russia, but some of her coalition partners are much more pro-Russian. So you have that issue going on. But also, a few weeks back, we actually saw protests about the war and about rising energy costs in Prague. Both the left and the right came together and protested. Is that the concern going forward? It's the mixture of politics, where you may have some people who are a bit more pro-Russia, combined with, if those energy costs really do hit home, you have more and more people getting angry about the situation.
That's always been the concern here in Kyiv, and I guess in London and Washington and Berlin. But again, if the sanctions appear to be working, if Russia appears to be fraying, if there's meltdown inside Russia, widely reported because people don't want to fight, and if the Ukrainians can double down on military successes in the battlefield, those misgivings to some extent fade away, because then people will be able to say, well, this is worth it. The argument that people like Salvini in Italy have used quite effectively, and also Le Pen in France, and remember she had an election success in June in the assembly elections. So the Swedish far-right party did very well in the Swedish elections a month ago. The far-right in Europe is much friendlier towards Putin. Rather like the far left, actually, but far left parties aren't in power or close to power. But their argument has always been, why should we punish the European consumer? Why should Germans or Frenchmen be forced to have cold showers for a war that can't be won? But if the war can be won, that cold shower seems a little bit warmer.
And so finally, Matt, are we at a more pivotal moment than ever before? Because before, one might have assumed that, the long-going stalemate in some ways was a better status quo than what we currently have, because it feels like there's, on the one hand, you have Putin, who more than ever doesn't want to admit defeat. And on the other hand, you have a Ukrainian side that feels the upper hand and that wants to win this thing. And that means that neither side is going to be willing to negotiate, have a ceasefire.
Yeah, this is it. I mean, this is a pivotal moment, and it's a moment of peril. It's a moment of peril because of the weapons that might be used if Putin is pushed further into a corner. And we all know about Putin in corners. He doesn't like them, and he lashes out when he's in them. But it's also a pivotal moment for, as we just said, for sanctions and the Western resolve in dealing with this. And fundamentally, at the heart of this is a very worrying question, both for the Ukrainians but also for the rest of Europe. Even if Vladimir Putin is removed, right, talking about the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, is the alternative that will replace him any better, or could it even be worse? could he be replaced by someone who does want all-out war with NATO? What does the Russian population actually want? And that's an open question. We know they don't want to fight here. They don't want to die in Ukraine. And some of them anecdotally are saying, why should we fight our own brothers and sisters in Ukraine? But a lot of them who don't want to die are also nationalists and want to project Russian power and in favor of something, that may replace Putin. And so we're looking at years, if not decades, of instability at the heart of Europe. And energy is just, the sharp end of it right now. But it could become a much bigger question. And I don't think that anyone in Europe has really thought carefully about the long future of what it means to have a dysfunctional rogue nuclear power on your doorstep. And that's really the unpleasant, inconvenient truth raised by this whole episode.
Matt Frei, thank you very much for talking to me.
It's a pleasure.